He walked into the Hargrove Motors showroom at 7:43 in the morning with a thermos of black coffee, a 6-year-old girl holding his left hand, and enough grease under his fingernails that the receptionist's smile flickered for just a half second before she caught it and put it back. His name was Callum Marsh. He was 38 years old. He owned a garage on the edge of Delwood, Tennessee, that had 14 parking spots, one hydraulic lift that groaned when it was cold, and a hand-painted sign above the door that his daughter had helped him make the summer she turned 4. The sign said Marsh Auto in green letters, and underneath, in smaller green letters that went slightly uphill because she'd gotten excited, it said, "We fix what others won't." He hadn't put that part there as a boast. He'd put it there because it was true, and because the town of Delwood was small enough that the truth was the only advertising that worked for long. The girl's name was Nora. She had her mother's eyes, which was something Callum noticed every single morning and had not yet figured out how to stop noticing. Dark brown, steady, the kind of eyes that watched things carefully before deciding what to think about them. She was watching the showroom now, the gleaming epoxy floors, the track lighting positioned to make every hood panel catch fire, the cars arranged like museum pieces inside a room that smelled of money and something like cedar. And she wasn't saying anything, which meant she was absorbing. Nora absorbed things. She'd gotten that from her mother, too. "Can I look at the red one?" she said. "Don't touch it." "I know, Dad." He did know that she knew. He just said it anyway. It was one of those things. The reason Callum was standing in the most expensive private dealership in Hargrove County on a Tuesday morning, thermos in hand, daughter beside him, had started 3 days earlier with a phone call he almost didn't answer. The number wasn't in his contacts. It had a Nashville area code. He'd been underneath a '94 Silverado at the time, working on a brake line that had corroded from the inside in a way that suggested the previous owner had driven it through standing water more times than they'd ever admitted. He let it ring. Then it rang again. Then a third time. And something about the third time made him slide out from under the truck and answer it, mostly because only 2 kinds of people called 3 times. People who genuinely needed something and robocallers didn't usually call from Nashville at 6 in the evening. The voice on the other end was a woman's, efficient, the kind of voice that was used to speaking and being listened to without having to ask twice. "Is this Callum Marsh, of Marsh Auto in Delwood?" "Yes, ma'am. My name is Diane Hargrove. I'm told you're the person in this region who knows vintage European engines." He'd leaned against the Silverado's tire. "Who told you that?" "Pete Calloway, over at Calloway Restoration in Franklin. He said, and I'm quoting directly, that if the engine is pre-1975 and it's something rare enough that everyone else has given up on it, Marsh is the last call worth making." Callum had looked at the garage around him. The Silverado, a Dodge Caravan with a coolant leak, a riding lawnmower someone had dropped off as a favor, which he hadn't figured out how to say no to. He'd thought about Pete Calloway, who was a good mechanic and not the type to hand out referrals loosely. "What's the car?" Callum said. There was the smallest pause on the other end. A 1969 Maserati Ghibli. Original drivetrain. It hasn't run in 14 months. He hadn't said anything for a moment. "Mr. Marsh, I'm here," he said. "I'm just thinking." The Hargrove name was not unknown to him. Most people in that part of Tennessee knew the Hargrove name in roughly the same way they knew the name of the mountain that sat on the western horizon. As a permanent feature of the landscape that had been there before them and would be there after, that exerted a certain gravity without needing to announce itself. Preston Hargrove had built the dealership group in the 70s. His daughter Diane had run it for the past decade and a half, and had, by most accounts, made it considerably larger and considerably more formidable than her father had left it. Hargrove Motors moved about 400 vehicles a year. They had a private collection wing attached to the main Hargrove showroom in Gallatin that wasn't open to the public. And that was, Callum had heard from the same circuit of mechanics and restorers that eventually got word of everything. Exceptional. He'd never been in it. He'd also never worked on a Ghibli, though he knew the engine, a twin-cam 4.7-liter V8 designed by Giulio Alfieri, produced in limited numbers, with a carburetor setup that required patience and a very specific kind of stubbornness to get right when it went wrong. He knew it the way he knew most engines he hadn't touched, From manuals, from forums, from the particular attention he'd given to the ones he wished had come through his garage and hadn't. "How many shops have looked at it?" he asked. Another pause. "Smaller this time." "4," Diane Hargrove said, "including our own service team." He'd understood then why Pete Calloway's name was attached to this phone call. Pete was good, Pete's team was good. If Pete had looked at a Ghibli and referred it out, it wasn't because the job was simple. "I can come look at it," Callum said. "I'm not promising anything." "I'm not asking for promises," she said. "I'm asking for a look." He'd hung up and stood in his garage for a while. Nora was at school. The Caravan was dripping coolant onto a piece of cardboard he'd put under it 3 days ago and hadn't gotten back to. Outside, the October afternoon was the color of old brass. He thought about the Ghibli. He thought about the way certain engines were like certain people. Built with intention, capable of extraordinary things, and deeply unforgiving of anyone who came at them without understanding what they were. He didn't sleep much that night. Getting Nora ready in the mornings was a negotiation that Callum had, over the past 3 years, become very practiced at conducting without either of them realizing it was a negotiation. It had started when she was 3, after her mother died, when everything was raw and strange, and Nora had developed a fierce and wordless attachment to routine that Callum understood completely because he had developed the same one. The routine was the rope. They held on. Tuesdays were early. Nora's school didn't start until 8:15, which meant that on a normal Tuesday, Callum dropped her off and opened the garage by 8:30, and the day had a shape to it. On this Tuesday, school was closed for a staff development day he'd gotten a notice about, and then lost the notice, and then remembered 3 days later, which was, he thought, about average for his organizational situation. So Nora was coming with him. She didn't mind. Nora had been coming to garages her whole life. She knew how to sit on a shop stool and not touch things that were hot or sharp, or that she hadn't been given specific permission to touch. She had a little backpack that she'd packed herself and that contained, as far as Callum could tell, 3 books, a package of crackers, a small notebook in which she drew things, and a velvet pouch that held a set of 1/4-inch drive sockets that Callum had given her for her birthday and that she considered important to have available. She'd named the velvet pouch Gerald. He didn't know why. He hadn't asked. The drive from Delwood to Gallatin took just under an hour. They stopped for gas, and Callum got Nora a chocolate milk, which she held in her lap with both hands, and drank with the focused pleasure of someone who understood that chocolate milk was a gift and not a given. She asked him twice what the car was going to look like. He described the Ghibli as best he could, the long hood, the fastback roofline, the way the Italians in the late 60s had been building cars the way other people built cathedrals, with an almost aggressive belief that beauty was not optional. Nora had considered this. Was it expensive? When it was new? Yes. Very. Is it expensive now? More. She'd nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. The Hargrove showroom was exactly what the name suggested it would be, glass and steel. The kind of architecture that was designed to communicate certainty, that the people inside knew exactly what they were doing and had been doing it for long enough that the building itself had absorbed that confidence. The cars on the main floor were all late model, high gloss, the kind of clean that didn't come from washing but from never quite getting dirty. The receptionist, a young woman in a gray blazer who'd recovered her smile admirably fast, called someone named Mr. Pressman, who appeared after about 90 seconds wearing a suit that cost more than Callum's hydraulic lift. Pressman was the service director. He had the particular manner of someone who had been working for a long time in proximity to wealth and had developed a way of making people feel either included in it or excluded from it, depending on what the situation required. Callum was not difficult to read. "Mr. Marsh," Pressman said, and extended a hand. "Thanks for making the drive. Happy to." Callum shook the hand. "This is my daughter, Nora." Pressman looked at Nora with the expression of someone recalibrating quickly. "Of course. Hello there." Nora said hello. She was studying the cars. "Hargrove is in the private collection. I can take you back." They walked through a door that required a badge and down a corridor that was quieter and cooler than the showroom floor, and that opened into the collection wing, which was large and low-lit and smelled of clean oil and something Callum couldn't quite name. Not leather exactly. More like the memory of leather, the suggestion of decades of careful use. There were 11 cars. He didn't count them immediately, but he felt them the way you feel a room that has the right number of people in it. Like the space had been thought about. Like nothing was accidental. Diane Hargrove was standing near the far wall. She was in her mid-50s, Callum guessed, with short gray hair and the posture of someone who had stopped being uncertain about things a long time ago. She was looking at a car, the Ghibli. It was silver, not the bright metallic silver of modern cars, but something older and more considered, a shade that seemed to change slightly as you moved around it, as though it were lit from inside. The body was clean. The chrome was intact. It sat on the floor of the collection room with the particular stillness of a thing that had not moved in a long time. Diane Hargrove turned when she heard them come in. "Mr. Marsh," she said. Then seeing Nora, "Good morning, Nora said. She was looking at the Ghibli. Callum looked at it too. He walked toward it the way he always walked toward a car he hadn't met yet, slowly, with his hands behind his back, starting at the nose and moving around the passenger side. He didn't say anything. Diane Hargrove didn't say anything either, which he appreciated. Pressman had his arms folded. Nora had found a spot near the wall and sat down cross-legged on the floor, which was something she did when she intended to be somewhere for a while. He crouched at the driver's side and looked through the window. Original interior. The leather on the seats was slightly faded in the places where the sun had gotten to it through the rear glass, but it was intact. The dash was all original. The instruments, the wood trim, the small Maserati badge at the center. The steering wheel had been held by hands that had known what it was. "Who owned it before?" Callum asked. "A private collector in Memphis," Diane said. "He passed away 4 years ago. His estate sold it at auction 18 months ago." "You bought it at auction?" "We did. And it was running then?" The auction listing described it as running. "We drove it from the transport truck to the collection floor, and it started twice after that before it stopped." Callum stood up. He looked at the hood. "May I?" "Please." He lifted the hood. The engine was, and this was the word that came to him before any technical assessment, beautiful. The twin camshaft covers, the intake manifold, the 4 twin-choke Weber carburetors, arranged in a line, the whole architecture of the thing, built with a logic that was also an aesthetic, a thing where the function and the form had been designed by the same mind and hadn't been in conflict. He stood there for a moment just looking at it. Nora had come up beside him. She was looking at the engine. "Is that the sick one?" she said. "That's the one," he said. "It looks okay. Most things look okay until you know what to look for." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things and then went back to her spot by the wall. Callum spent the next 40 minutes with the car. He pulled the plugs and read them. He checked the float levels on all 4 carburetors. He checked the fuel delivery. He tested the compression on each cylinder. He checked the timing. He did all of this without speaking, except to ask twice for a specific tool that Pressman went to find and brought back with the expression of someone who had expected this to be a shorter visit. Diane Hargrove watched without speaking. He noted this again. It was not a small thing. When he was done, he stood up and cleaned his hands on the rag he'd brought from the truck. A habit so old he didn't think about it, and turned to face her. "What did the other shop say?" he asked. "Carburetor failure on 2 of the 4. They recommended sourcing replacement units from an Italian supplier. Lead time of 4 to 6 months, cost of approximately $9,000. "They were wrong," Callum said. "Or not entirely wrong. 2 of the carbs do need attention, but that's not why it won't run." Diane was very still. "The camshaft timing has slipped," he said. "Probably gradual, over years of sitting and starting and sitting again. The carbs are masking it, because when the timing is off, the mixture never burns correctly no matter how well the carbs are set. So anyone looking at the carbs first is going to keep finding problems there. They're not wrong about what they see. They're just not seeing far enough." Pressman made a small sound. "Can you fix it?" Diane asked. Callum looked at the Ghibli. "The timing I can address tonight if I have access to the car and a space to work. The carburetors, 2 of them are rebuildable. One of the other 2 is marginal. I'd want to assess it properly before I commit to that. The 4th is fine. Tonight," Diane said. It was not quite a question. "I'd rather work at night. Fewer interruptions." He paused. "And I think better at night. Always have." She studied him for a moment, the way you study something you are deciding whether to trust, which was, Callum thought, A reasonable thing to do with a person you had met 45 minutes ago who was standing in your collection room telling you they'd found something 4 other shops had missed. "What would you need?" she said. "Access to the bay, my tools, a light." He thought for a second. "And somewhere for Nora to sleep if this runs past 10. Nora, who had been drawing in her notebook, looked up when she heard her name. Diane looked at her, then back at Callum. "I think we can manage that," she said. "The thing about a diagnosis that everyone else has missed is that the satisfaction of finding it lasts for approximately 4 minutes, and then the work starts, and the work is the same regardless of how it was found." The Ghibli's timing chain had stretched, not dramatically, but enough over years of intermittent use and sitting, and the particular unkindness that time does to fine machinery when it is not regularly exercised, and it had pulled the timing off by a margin that was invisible in any single system, but ruinous in combination. The car had been trying to run for 14 months against a problem that made every other system perform worse, so that anyone looking at individual components kept finding issues, kept addressing them, kept waiting for the car to respond, and kept being disappointed. It wasn't that the other mechanics were bad. It was that the car had been failing in the way that some problems fail. Not in one obvious place, but distributed across everything, so that the shape of the problem only became visible when you stopped looking at the parts and looked at the whole. Callum had spent 23 years learning to look at the whole. He started at 9:15 with the timing chain. The bay that the Hargrove service team had cleared for him was large and clean, lit with the kind of overhead lighting that meant business, and quiet in the way that only a professional space after hours can be quiet. A deep, functional silence that felt earned. He'd set up his tools with the same order he always used, laid out on a clean shop cloth in the sequence he'd used them. A habit his first supervisor had beaten into him at 22, and that he'd never questioned because the reasoning was sound. When your hands know where everything is, your mind is free to stay with the problem. Nora was asleep in the small break room on the couch under his jacket. She'd lasted until about 8:30 before the crackers and the chocolate milk and the long day caught up with her. She'd asked him to wake her up when the car was done. He'd said okay. He probably wouldn't, because she had school the next day, but the agreement had seemed important to her, and so he'd made it. There was a photo of her mother on his phone. He didn't look at it intentionally, not usually, but sometimes when he unlocked the screen in low light it would catch him, and he'd have a second of something that wasn't grief exactly anymore, more like the ghost of grief, the place where grief had been that still felt like something when you pressed it. Rachel had died when Nora was 3. An aneurysm, which was a word Callum had understood before and understood completely after, and that he still occasionally encountered in conversation or in print, and that still did something to his chest when he did. Rachel had not known anything about cars. She'd grown up in a house where cars were appliances, things that moved you between places and that were replaced when they stopped working, and she'd found his relationship to engines, the love of them, the careful attention, the way he could lose 2 hours to a problem and have it feel like 10 minutes, genuinely puzzling, not critical, just puzzling, like discovering your spouse was fluent in a language you'd never encountered. She'd come to the garage sometimes on Saturday afternoons and sit on the stool he kept near the lift and drink coffee and watch him work. She hadn't asked many questions. Mostly she'd just been there. He had thought, at various points over the years since, that this was the most purely loving thing anyone had ever done for him. Not to understand it or share it, but to be there while it happened, to decide that because it mattered to him, it was worth her time. He thought about this, sometimes when the work was in a rhythm and his hands were moving without needing much direction from his brain. Tonight he thought about it, while he eased the timing chain off its sprockets with the particular care you used with metal that was old and had been stressed, and that you needed to not damage getting out, because putting it back together was hard enough without introducing new problems on the way in. It was 11:40 when he had the timing set. He did it twice, then a third time, because the Ghibli system was not forgiving of approximation, and because the other shops had already approximated at this car, and it had not thanked them for it. He checked the phasing on both camshafts against the spec in the manual he'd downloaded onto his phone and printed at the Hargrove front desk before the service team left, slightly to Pressman's visible surprise. Then he went to the carburetors. Two of them came apart exactly as he expected and went back together, better than they'd been. Their needle valves reset, their float chambers clean, their jets clear. The third was the one he'd been uncertain about. He sat with it for a while on the workbench, not working on it yet, just looking, and turned it in his hands the way you turn something you were trying to read. There was corrosion at the base of one of the venturi tubes that suggested water ingestion at some point, probably not recently but not ancient either. And the accelerator pump diaphragm had a hairline crack that would cause exactly the kind of stumble and hesitation that several of the service notes described. He could work with it. He rebuilt it, slowly, which was the only speed that made sense for something with that many small parts that had to work together exactly. He finished at 2:07 in the morning. He sat on the shop stool next to the Ghibli for a few minutes. His back ached in the way it ached after a long night standing on concrete, a specific complaint from a specific place in his lower back that he'd first noticed at 35 and that had been getting slightly more vocal about its concerns ever since. He drank the last of the thermos, which was cold by now. It didn't matter. He wasn't drinking it for the warmth. Then he got in the Ghibli. The seat was low. Lower than modern cars. You sat in it rather than on it, which was the right way to put it. The relationship of person to machine at that angle, implying a different understanding of what driving was supposed to feel like. He adjusted slightly. His hands found the steering wheel. He turned the key. The starter engaged with the distinctive sound of the Ghibli's pre-engaged starter motor, a sound he knew from recordings, and that was different from the recording. In the same way that all real things are different from their recordings. More present, more immediate, carrying the actual vibration of the components rather than a representation of it. The engine caught on the third revolution, and then it ran. Not stumbled, not hesitated, not coughed through the first few seconds like a sick thing trying to prove it was well. It ran cleanly and immediately, the idle settling into the particular note of the 4.7 that he had heard described, and that was not like other engine sounds, not the blunt American torque he worked with most days, but something European and precise, a voice that had been designed as deliberately as everything else about the car. He sat there for a moment. Outside, beyond the bay doors, the parking lot was empty. The lights over the service entrance made a small bright island in the dark. He could hear rain, distant, approaching, a Tennessee October night, doing what Tennessee October nights did, turning cool and wet and imminent. He didn't rev it. There was no need. The idle said everything. After a couple of minutes, he shut it off. He sat in the quiet of the collection wing for a moment. Then he got out, closed the hood, cleaned up his station, and walked down the corridor to the break room. Nora was still on the couch. She'd pulled his jacket up, around her shoulders in her sleep. The velvet pouch with the sockets was sitting beside her on the cushion, and her notebook was open to a page where she'd drawn something before she fell asleep. He could see it from the doorway. He looked at it in the dim light from the corridor. It was the Ghibli, recognizably, drawn in pencil with the particular combination of inaccuracy and instinct that a 6-year-old brings to the things that catch their attention. The lines weren't right. The proportions were off. But she'd given it something, some quality of attention, of noticing, that made him look at it for longer than he expected to. He sat down in the chair across from her. He thought about Rachel. He thought about the way Nora carried her eyes around in her face every day and didn't know it. He thought about what it meant to be good at something, not just technically proficient, but genuinely capable, in the way that required years of specific attention that couldn't be rushed or substituted. He thought about Pete Calloway calling his shop the last call, worth making, which was either a compliment or a description of a position he hadn't chosen but had arrived at anyway. He didn't wake Nora. He found a second jacket in his truck. He kept one there, had for years, because Tennessee was a state that changed its mind about temperature with no warning, and brought it in and added it to the one she was already using and then sat back down in the chair and closed his eyes. Because there was no point in driving an hour back to Delwood at 2 in the morning when the work was done and the car was running and the rain was coming. When Nora woke him up at 6:45, she said, "Did you fix it?" "Yes," he said. She thought about this for a second, the way she thought about things. "Can I hear it?" He took her into the collection wing before anyone else was in the building and started the Ghibli and let the engine settle into its idle. and Nora stood beside the car with her arms crossed. The way she crossed her arms when she was paying close attention to something, and she listened. "It sounds different from ours," she said. She meant the truck. "It's a different kind of engine. Is it better?" He thought about how to answer that. "It's not better or worse. It's what it is. It was built to be exactly this. That's the thing about it." She listened for another few seconds. "Okay," she said. "And then, can we get breakfast?" They were in the truck, Nora with her backpack and her velvet pouch and the last of the crackers, when Diane Hargrove pulled into the lot at 7:20. She parked beside them and got out, and he lowered his window. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the building behind them. "It's running," he said. She was quiet for a second that stretched in a way he didn't try to fill. "I'll have Pressman cut you a check this morning," she said. "And I'd like to discuss an arrangement, if you're open to it. We have 6 other cars in that collection that haven't been properly serviced. I'd rather not send them to people who are going to miss the problem." He looked at the steering wheel. Nora was already eating a cracker. "I've got a full week," he said. "But after that, I can talk." Diane Hargrove nodded. She wasn't the type to push. He'd figured that out about her the day before. In the same way you figured out the character of an engine before you touched it. By listening, by watching, by paying the kind of attention that told you what something was before you had to find out the hard way. She went inside. He drove them to a diner 2 miles up the road that had booths with red vinyl seats and a coffee that was not particularly good and that he drank gratefully anyway. And Nora had pancakes and ate them the way she ate all food, with the kind of systematic focus that suggested she'd learned early that meals were important and not to be wasted. She told him about something her friend at school had said last week, a story that involved a playground dispute about whether a dog could theoretically drive a car, which was a theological question as far as Nora was concerned. And she had views. He listened. Outside, the rain that had been coming all night had arrived, softening the morning, turning the parking lot to mirror, beating on the diner windows. The other booths were filling with people who had been up since before dawn, coffee drinkers and truck drivers, and the particular kind of early riser who treats the first hour of the day as something private, something to be sat with carefully before the rest of it begins. He felt the ache in his back that meant he'd been on concrete too long. He felt the tiredness that sat behind his eyes after a night of close work. He felt underneath these things something that was harder to name, but that he'd come to recognize over the years as the particular satisfaction of a thing done correctly. Not celebrated, not announced, just done. The work completed to the standard the work required, no more and no less. Rachel would have asked him how it went, the way she always asked. And he would have said, "Fine," the way he always said. And she would have known from the way he said it that it had gone well, because she'd learned to read the register of his fine the same way he'd learned to read engines, by paying attention over time, by being present for enough repetitions that the pattern became visible. Nora was still talking about the dog. He got a refill on the coffee. It still wasn't good. He drank it. The rain came down. He thought, this is the life. Not a lesser version of some other life, not a life defined by what it was missing or by the loss at its center, but the actual thing, present and imperfect and his. The garage on the edge of Delwood, the hydraulic lift that groaned in the cold, the sign with the uphill letters, the red toolbox that traveled with him and that Nora had taken to calling Gerald for reasons he had still not asked about and that he was privately beginning to think might be her mother's kind of mystery. The thing that didn't explain itself, that just was, that made you love it more for not being entirely decipherable. "Dad," Nora said. "Yeah, I think dogs actually could probably steer. They just couldn't reach the pedals." He considered this seriously, which was the only way to consider things, Nora said. "That's probably right," he said. She nodded. She picked up her fork. Outside, the rain kept coming, and the morning opened up around them, ordinary and irreplaceable.